086 60 25,000 is our number for your text messages and on WhatsApp. Now, 1960s Ireland wasn't a time to have a disability, because there was a special place for children who had a disability back then, and that was behind the walls of an institution, cut off from the rest of society. Well, Martin Naughton, at just 9 years of age, was one of those children, and along with his younger sister Barbara, he was sent to an institution in Dublin, far away from his Irish-speaking home in Spiddal. But Martin wouldn't be sidelined, and with the help of some unexpected characters along the way, he began to change the way that a generation of young people with a disability saw themselves. Now, there's a book about Martin's life. It's called Never Know Your Place, and written by himself with the help of Joanna Marsden, who joins me now on the line. Joanna, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon to you, John. Nice to meet you.
Likewise. Now, tell us a little bit about, well, I suppose the early years in particular, and it was very, very tough on him at such a young age to be taken from Irish-speaking Spiddal and landed in an institution in Dublin.
Absolutely. I'd say it was a complete culture shock to him, because the book opens with him going on this train journey where he and his sister Barbara, they leave their lovely family home in Spiddal, which is an Irish-speaking community, and he's had a pretty normal upbringing until that point. And they go on the train to Dublin, and it's a kind of long, lonely journey where their whole world changes, and they arrive and they go to this institution in Baldoyle, which is a very anonymous kind of place where people feel like they're kind of cut off from their families. They're all medicalized. The language is English. Obviously, it's not Irish. He has to adjust to this language. It's all very routine orientated. You know, they get their hair cut. They get their hair checked for nits. They get the wound ointment put on it. They have to have their meals at certain times. They have to go to confession. There's a whole sense that you're part of a big machine, a big kind of sort of institutional machine. And after this informality of living in a warm community and being kind of free, there's this huge sense of shock for him, in adjusting.
And all because he had a disability.
Yes, yeah. And I mean, it's just so harsh, isn't it? It seems so harsh now, but then I think we have to remind ourselves that it was a time when they didn't have services. I know, let's be honest, there's still an ongoing struggle for so many people to get the services they need, but there were no services available. So, in order to get things like physiotherapy, they couldn't get those in Spiddal. So it wasn't a clear choice. It wasn't just send them off out of the way from the family's point of view. It was that they thought they were doing the best for them. And this is the way that society offered those services. And obviously the effect was that they were so cut off, and it was just such a painful experience.
He fought hard for his freedom and eventually got to move on from the institution. But it wasn't just from within that he was fighting. It was his whole lifetime that he was fighting for people with disabilities, for them to have independence.
Absolutely. I think it's that feeling he had, that he learned in the institution what it was like not to have that freedom about when you eat your dinner, where you go, how you live your life. And I think that became this kind of really profound awareness of what freedom is. And we know for most of us that you might think it's big things like, going on holiday and stuff, but actually a lot of the things are just the daily routines of having your cup of tea the way you like it. And, you're sitting in a space and all that you enjoy being in and with people. So he really understood what it meant to have freedom, what freedom was on a day-to-day basis. And he fought to get that for himself. And that was a really hard thing for him to get. And when he got it, he could have just chosen to go on with his own life, to move to America, which is what he really wanted to do. But in the end, he said, no, this is where I'm from. These are the people I grew up alongside in the institution. I want to go back and support them to live a different model of life where we have personal assistance, which can support people who can support people in their own homes, so that, automatic institutionalization isn't something that people have to face anymore. In
a way, PAs, many people take them for granted now. But back when Martin started speaking out about the value of PAs, it was groundbreaking.
It was, and I think he talks in the book about this first time where he tries to explain the concept, and a few of them get PAs, or that Martin starts actually paying for them himself, and he kind of realizes this is my PA when he sees them in America. But he's got to introduce the idea to Irish people who haven't seen this; they've no idea, and it seems like he's aware that they might think it's just mad money, or but he's actually saying no, this is actually cheaper to have them people supporting you in your home so that you can work, so that you can be part of society. But it isn't something that people can get their head around. So the first few years, it's all about being seen. So everybody in Dublin knew Martin. And it wasn't just because he was campaigning. It was because he made sure he was seen everywhere. Because if you've seen someone going around with a PA, you kind of get your head around it. We've all seen it now in our towns. We're used to it. But I think if you go back, a lot of people I've sort of said to, if you go back into your childhood, or if you're around in the sort of 70s, or, people around even, at the 60s, in the 60s at the same time, they wouldn't have had any sense that people with disabilities were visible in society. They were just hidden away. And now they're visible. And that's because Martin began that process of saying, we're here, we're not going to be locked up anymore. We want to be seen. And that's what the book is about, really.
He helped to change a lot of people's perspectives of people with disabilities, and also those with disabilities themselves, and gave them a look at what was possible and what could be achieved and what they deserved.
Yeah, I think that's true. And you know what? I've learned a lot. I don't have a disability. I have many friends who do, but I think I learned a lot myself from this book. And one of the first principles that applies regardless is that if you want to change the world around you, the first thing you have to change is how you see yourself. And that comes across in relation to the disabled people he grew up alongside, that they first had to kind of think, I do not belong in this place that I've been cut off. I can actually expect more. The idea of the book, Never Know Your Place, is don't accept where society puts you, question, and then try to see yourself in a different light, and then try and expand your worldview, make it bigger, mix with other people. So that kind of process of changing how we see ourselves applies to anybody who gets stuck in any kind of place in society. And I think it's something that whether you have a disability or not, you can learn from, shake things up in order to change how you see yourself. And then other people might see you differently, but they're not going to see you differently if you don't see yourself differently.
The United States were way ahead of us in rights for people with disabilities, and Martin looked to the States a lot, made a lot of friends over the years in the States, and looked at various campaigns over there, and then I suppose brought the ideas back here and said, listen, if it can work there, it can work here.
Absolutely. I often think it's amazing how it can be one person who brings an idea that comes from, because now we kind of assume that ideas spread through technology and everything. But at the time, Martin actually went to the US, and he went to the US looking like loads of young Irish lads at the time, wanted to make a business, have a life for himself. He just fancied the whole idea. But while he was over there, he got kind of sucked back into to the disability world, and he met these amazing American activists who were influenced themselves by the civil rights movement. And they were very much people who would do like kind of protests in public buildings. They were so far ahead of the way things were in Ireland. And he imbibed all of that. And he kind of had his own mind opened, I think. I mean, at one point he actually describes going in to meet this activist called Fred Fay. And Fred Fay is lying on a sort of a stretcher sort of setup. And that's the way he has to live. And Martin himself says, like, he has his own prejudices. He says, this is so depressing. And he's like, get me out of here. And he whispers to his sort of PA, I'll be, don't hang around. We're going to get out of here. And then he ends up being so fascinated by a guy who actually has charisma and kind of energy for life, despite these huge physical restrictions. So his own prejudices are lost. And he brings back this, and Fred keeps saying to him, what's your story? Ask people what their story is. And what's your story, Martin? And I think Martin starts thinking, well, my story is that I'm a lad from Spiddal. I'm raised in an institution, and that is who I am. And maybe we have a kind of responsibility to do something with the story, because we don't choose our story. It is who we are. And I think there is that kind of process in the book of him saying, well, this is who I am. So I go back. And that's, what he makes it. He wants to be a person of use and influence. He kind of has that sense about him as a person,
And over the course of his lifetime, I think achieved a lot more than he ever realized, that even at the time.
I think it just kind of accumulated and became who he was. And Yeah, I mean, it's obvious he achieved so much because I've had some lovely comments from young activists who kind of are realizing that things that they took for granted, this is where it came from. And a few of them, maybe that kind of the ones in the late 20s would have known Martin, but the younger ones don't know him, but they're actually saying, oh, starting to connect with this sense of this is where things changed in Ireland. And I mean, yeah, there's a lot more that needs to be done, but it is that start of a movement that's actually quite important to people having a sense of identity. But I mean, a price was paid for it. And I think it's in one of the interesting things in the book is that there is a sense in which Martin maybe sacrificed some of his own personal kind of his own personal wishes in life. He doesn't say it a lot, but he lived his life very publicly, you know. Yeah. He focused on advocacy. And I think he would have liked to have done other things in life. He would have liked to have gone to America. And, you know, there are things that get given up and he doesn't go on and on about them. But they are there in the book, I think.
Well,
you know,
isn't that the way with all the biggest campaigners, that they give over so much of their life to the cause as it was? And yeah. You mentioned there about the United States. He died in 2016, but a matter of months before that went on something of a pilgrimage to the United States.
He did, yeah. He went on the Selma to Montgomery Trail, and I think that was about him kind of trying to connect with the civil rights, movement. He really took a lot of inspiration from not only from disabled leaders in America, but also from the Black kind of civil rights movement. That was he considered that to be very much a kind of something that came from the ground up. In life, he was inspired by a lot of things. That was one of them. You know, Celtic Football Club was another. But he had these places that he kind of went to for inspiration. And I think towards the end of his life there, he was kind of looking for that, going back to the well, so to speak, to pay tribute to other activists because he knew he'd given his life to that. And I suppose he was probably hoping that he might get another few years and this would maybe give him the inspiration to kind of go back for another round, because he was worried about the next generation coming up behind him and that they weren't getting enough hours of the PA service. So, you know, he wasn't like retiring and saying, didn't I do a great job? He was thinking about the future.
You mentioned Celtic there. Tell us about the connection with Celtic, because it's while he was in an institution in Dublin that I suppose that really made a lot of people sit up and take note, because it was a trip over to Celtic Park, and he got to meet the captain, the then captain Billy McNeill, who was really good to him.
Billy McNeill was amazing, and I found it quite interesting hearing about this story. Even though I'm not like a big football person, I really have a soft spot for Celtic now, having heard how amazing they were. And it actually started before he went over there. They came to Ireland on Patrick's Day, and they were on their way to visit De Valera in the Phoenix Park. This was after the whole European Cup, the Lisbon Lions team, and the whole team came over. And somehow somebody must have arranged for them to stop in the hospital. And they stopped and they visited the kids in the hospital. And that was like, Martin describes it as like a light that was over these kind of big guys who would have been like superheroes at the time. And to this day, to some extent. And it made them feel as if they hadn't been forgotten. Because if these guys knew they existed. And so for Martin, it's a bit of a light bulb moment, and it changes how he sees himself. And then he kind of tries to build a rapport. And actually, Billy McNeill takes a shine to him, and he buys him his first power wheelchair, and he invites him over to Celtic Park. And he gives him pieces of advice that are kind of funny, you know, because Billy McNeill was a big guy and he had like a lot of presence. And Martin says he was when he came into a room, he kind of had a quiet way of controlling the room. Mm-hmm. And Martin is known for that, or was known for that as well. And Billy McNeill said to him, you got to remember, like when there's one moment in the book where he's about to bring Martin into the locker room in Celtic Park. And he says, remember, these guys are more nervous of you than you are of them. And it's that awkwardness around disability. And I think Martin thinks, hold on, this could be used to my advantage. I mean, not in an evil way, in a cheeky way, but in the interests of good. Yeah. And I think we have to laugh at that and sort of say, yeah, he took advantage of awkwardness to make things better. And that Celtic visit was just, you know, it was a very symbolic occasion in his life. Yeah. And I suppose it was the community in Baldoyle as well. There would have been a lot of Celtic supporters, and like one of the nice characters in the book, there's a couple of ordinary people. Like the nuns can be quite harsh, obviously, but there's like a hospital porter who's a big Celtic supporter. And these are the people who actually bring real sort of human warmth into Martin's life and the life of the children. And Celtic is what unites them. It's this love of football. It's this sense that even if you come from a really poor background, that you can actually change things if you kind of have a power of community. So that's another big influence on him, you know.
Well, his love of Celtic never left him, and that story about getting to go to Celtic Park and meet Billy McNeill and the rest of the team in 1973 is detailed in the book, as are a number of other great stories about Martin and his life and his campaigning. It's called Never Know Your Place, Memoir of a Rule Breaker. Joanna Marsden, thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Get with the best. Virgin Media, Ireland's best broadcast.